character like came to me very clearly, and the story was there, but I just could not find a starting point. And I stopped writing it at a certain point and wrote my story in cards, The Family Arcana, which has a piece of the story on each card of the deck, and you shuffle it and read it in any order. And that somehow, like, breaking down my sense of structure and story completely, just broke it open for me, and suddenly I knew what I was doing. So the beginning of the book has a similar sort of feel to it, I think, where you have these short sections, these brief glimpses into the world that kind of come and go. I thought of them almost like train stops. Like you get to kind of peer into the station, and then you're off to the next location. And that is The Family Arcana has that kind of reference in it as well. So, but the naming song it's a novel set in a strange future after language has been lost from the world. There was an apocalyptic event that broke down language, but broke down a lot of other borders as well. So people's dreams escape as monsters, and there are ghosts about. They're a little different from the ghosts we think of as sort of ethereal creatures. They're more of a physical type of being in this world. And there are these committees who are trying to kind of reestablish order in the world and return words to things and return the borders to things. So the main character, she is herself unnamed. She literally doesn't have a name, and she works as a courier for the names committee. As I'm describing all this, I'm remembering that the thing I actually started with came to me in a bit of a panic, actually. When I finished my first novel, my editor said, when I met him at one point, like, so what's the next book? And I didn't really have a clear idea at that point. And I just blurted out the phrase, post-apocalyptic Alice's Adventures in Wonderland on a Train. And that just stuck with me. I was like, you know what, I'm gonna do that. That sounds good. And so I started with that, and I had this image of this, Alice-like character, I guess, who would be on a train, and I decided she was a courier. But then I was like, well, what is she delivering? And I figured, okay, she's delivering a word. And then I knew I was in trouble, because if she's delivering a word, that means there are words missing, and I have to write a novel set in this place where there is a lack of language. And that was the hardest part of this, and I will never do this to myself again, is that I wrote the book in such a way that the narrator does not use any words which do not exist for the characters in the world. And so it's a very limited kind of diction, which expands slowly over the course of the book as more words are introduced into the setting. So that aspect of it is a thing which was kind of bedeviling to work with as a writer, because I would think, of a word that I wanted to use, but I would be like, it's like too ornate or too extra of a word. Like I've got to keep it down to the basics. But by doing that, I also found a sort of rhythm and a kind of musicality that I really started to appreciate, that developed in its own terms, that I don't think I would have found my way to otherwise. So I'll just read like a couple of the first beginning little sections. The book starts with the courier out on assignments, where she is delivering words to things that need words, and hopefully give you a sense of how it sounds in my head, and hopefully on the page as well. She delivered echo. She delivered echo into a nameless gorge at the edge of everything she knew. Water dripped from rock walls and from the limbs of trees by the river down there. She called out the word, and the word rolled back to her 3, 4, 5 times, the thing calling itself by name, echo. Birds flew out of the gorge. One of the men who'd followed from Jawbone spoke echo, quiet to himself. He said the word sounded strange to him. They always sound strange at first, she said. She delivered stowaway. She climbed aboard a freight train, hid herself in one of the boxcars, dozed as the train rolled east along the canal. The doors slid open to gray light and the rumble of Hollow's factories. 2 watchers peered inside, ghost lenses flashing. She let one of the watchers see her, and he reached for his signal box. Before he could break it open, she stood and spoke the word for the thing she was, stowaway. The watchers spoke the new word to her and to each other until they were sure they had it right. Then they helped her down out of the car. The watchers were happy to have a word for those people, easier to catch them that way. I'll do one more word. She delivered brass. In an empty house at the edge of Tooth, she found a brass doorknob, a dented brass bowl, a brass cup. She tested their weight, felt the metal grow warm in her hands. She filled the cup with water from her canteen and drank. Then, with the taste of brass still on her tongue, she went outside and made the delivery. From boxes and trunks, out of attics and basements, people brought brass clocks, brass locks, brass toys, brass rings for the fingers, wrists, and neck. Some made noise with brass horns, while others covered their ears or smiled and shook their heads. Nobody knew how to play. From the factories of Hollow came new things of brass. The couriers of the Names Committee were issued brass buttons for their uniforms. She sat alone at her desk, working with heavy thread. So thanks. So the deliveries continue for a while, and without giving too much away, the courier ends up in a situation where she's kind of caught in a conspiracy between the named and the nameless. The fact that she is nameless at all is very strange for the position she holds, and so she's always kind of in a kind of liminal space between worlds, and so things go terribly wrong, and the committee of names actually all its members live together on a train called the number 12, and so they're always kind of making their way around the world, delivering words, delivering names to newborns, and also occasionally they are called upon when the borders expand to name new territories as well. There are, of course, nameless people, and the nameless don't want these things to be named, and so she falls into this conflict between them, and is also looking for a long-lost sister, and has a ghost who's a good friend, and some other stuff. There's one of the fun things about writing this book was like writing about things but not saying what they were because they're not named yet. So, for example, one of her close companions is this animal who's furry, and when you pet it, it kind of makes a rumbling sound. And so it was like, how could I find all these ways to describe this very familiar type of being and let the reader know exactly what's going on, but avoid the word. And it felt especially right for that type of animal because the nameless things in this world have a way of moving through the shadows or going unseen or just being very sneaky or troublesome. And so that was a fun thing to work with. Pardon me. The one other part of it I'll talk about because I think this is not giving too much away and will be really apparent as you read. But there's this period in the history, the sort of future history of the book, called the Silence, where there were no words for a long time, and that probably lasted about a generation. And so there were a few people who were very old when words came back into the world, but who remembered a few stories from their childhood. And so this gave me the opportunity, writing something like this when you're working on sort of a fantasy that's a little abstract. It's like I'm asking the reader to kind of come with me, somewhat of a distance to entertain the possibility of how this weird logic would work if you were to apply it. And so then part of the challenge becomes where are the stepping stones that I can provide to get across the stream. And so one of the things I had fun doing was to fold in a few familiar stories. So there's the story of the girl who went underground, which will very obviously be, and I already mentioned Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, that's there. And then there's the story of the child who never grew up, and the story of the child who flew in a storm to another place. And these things are kind of like these old familiar stories serve as models for some of the parts of the story that unfolds. I've always been drawn to folk tales and fairy tales and children's stories as just very generative material, and the kind of stuff that it feels like a treasure trove that you can just draw on endlessly. And so it was encouraging to me to imagine, a world, even if it was stripped entirely of language, might still preserve something of these like essential threads that you could connect between then and now. So let's see. This is maybe already the longest I've talked about this book at one go, and I'm now trying to figure out like how do I don't want to give away too much, right. But maybe we can turn it into a more of a conversation at this point. If you guys have questions, or if there's any part of that you'd like to hear more about, or about any of my other work, of course, I'm happy to discuss. Yes.
I would love to. I don't know if I might have read this in a review, but just holding this book, it felt very dreamy to me. And I was very interested in the concept of nightmares, escaping. And do you work with your own dreams, and do you keep a dream journal? I'm very curious.
Right. I have at times. There was this period when I was teaching a lot, and I found it was very hard to find time to do my own writing for a while. Uh-huh. And so there was this one time when I did start keeping a dream journal, and then because I can't help myself, I started turning them into stories. My idea was I would get up every morning and immediately write down whatever I had been dreaming, and then try to turn it into a spy story, which somehow felt like a really fun way to like give the dream some structure, yes. And some logic outside of its own logic. But I think a lot about dreaming. I think about writing as an almost kind of active dreaming. Mm-hmm. Like when the writing's going really well, it's almost like something of the unconscious takes over, and I might have an outline, but that can kind of fall into the background, and suddenly I'm in that space, and it's working with a logic of its own. So yeah, dreams. Trying to capture the logic of a dream in writing is such an interesting challenge.
It really is.
As things move and change so quickly. Yes. But it is a thing I find myself trying to do. It now occurs to me both in my first novel, The Manual of Detection, and in this one. There is a lot about dreams as a sort of territory to explore.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, thank you for explaining that, because there's just something about this book that feels that way. And also I'm interested in the title, because in the best book I've ever read about dream analysis, the person advises that you name every dream. And if you have enough details, you don't really require a huge amount of details. If you have one or two, salient details, even give your fragment a name.
Interesting.
Yes. And that really helps you conceptualize the story that the dream is trying to tell you.
That's fascinating to me. It reminds me of how in dreams it's so rare to actually see words. Yes. I've had that happen so often where I'll pick up a book in a dream and I just can't focus on it, or the words are nonsense. So the idea of kind of pinning it down with a word is a really compelling one.
And a name for Well, so one other thing about dreams. I could talk about dreams forever.
Oh, sure.
I'm very fascinated by them, and I've kept dream journals for years. But I feel like the really one of the wonderful things about dreams is the way they bring in what's already in you and combine it with the world at large, and you get this back and forth dialogue that occurs, and it can be very helpful in breaking creative blocks, I find.
Yeah, I agree. There's that thing that happens in dreams as well, which I try to capture in fiction, which is just this feeling of the unexpected, where something will happen and you'll be like, where did that come from? Like, how did I come up with that? That doesn't feel even like something that my brain knows to do. And that's it's a really nice thing to realize. No, it actually does. Like, we all have this stuff in there and kind of whirling around. And so, yeah, I do think you're right that it can be a good way to remove a block. It can be a good practice just to try to, well, I with dreams, but also I would say with games. I'm often drawn to games and game design, and like cooperative storytelling games or role-playing games have been a big deal for me since I was a child, and those things do a similar sort of work where it's because it's a collaborative kind of storytelling mode. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, and it develops organically, and others are participating. And so, how to capture that kind of feeling in fiction is a challenge I'm always trying to meet. Like, how do I give this the feeling of something that came out of nowhere, and and like that dreaming mind kind of gives up so much control, and I think that's part of it. It's like being able to let go in the writing process is can be really key.
I wanted to say something about the game aspect of it too, because when I was reading kind of the first 26 pages, I had the fact that you design games in mind as well, and I thought, I want to play this book, because of the complexity of what you're setting out of the world. It's almost like, in some ways, you're reading the rules of the universe of the game that you play in this book in those first chapters, and I thought I can see the game maker behind this.
Right. Great. Yeah. In a way, I'm like applying a set of strict rules, but then by doing so, I get a lot of freedom, to like work within those borders, and I think that's there's that whole like Oulipo school of writing, which kind of comes from that idea of like constraints applied to the work ultimately, or this like liberating thing, and that's a big part of what's going on here. Like, by not allowing myself to use all these words, I then like unlocked the way to make sentences that felt very different. And I do like to think of games too as a sort of as a model for how to collaborate with a reader who you have not met, right? Like I'm inviting you to play this with me, and I'm hoping to provide you with a sense of the rules so that you can feel like we're working together on this thing and puzzling this out. And so it's about kind of like leaving those spaces open and leaving that invitation open. I will also note that in my contract for this book, I was like, I want to keep the game adaptation rights just in case. So maybe I'll actually get to do something there.
That was smart. Yeah.
There are a couple games that come up in the book actually. Like the characters are playing certain games, and one of them is a card game called Hand and Moon, which connects to sort of the early history of the namers, and that's a thing I would love to do, is to make the card game called Hand and the Moon, which would have to be about words, and I haven't quite figured it out. Still working on that. Yeah.
When you're negotiating rights like that, is that something pretty easy for a publisher to give away, or is there a lot of give and take on it?
It's a good question. I'm lucky to have an agent who seems to be very good at his job, and I don't entirely know what that part of the negotiation was like, but I think sometimes like that I suspect that was seen as probably a little thing that they didn't mind, and like as like yeah, sure, you can have that, kid. But yeah, it's so funny. It's the whole process. I was thinking about this recently. Is so odd because you go out there looking for the right editor for your book, and you want to find somebody who understands what you're doing and who gets like gets you as a writer, as an artist, and then like you leave the room and that same person is the person who talks to your agent to like figure out a deal. And so, which is good because like you wouldn't necessarily always want that to be part of the conversation that you're having when you're figuring out, you know, how to edit the book. So, you know, and it's, there are certainly ways to manage that, and like in the world of small presses, like that is how it has to work often, and is usually fine. But yeah, it's a curious thing, and it goes through so many people too. It's like the editor needs to convince the marketing team that this is a good idea, and so it very quickly moves, you know, several steps beyond your control. Well, any last questions or thoughts?
I have something very random.
Oh yeah.
Oh, mine's kind of random too.
Oh. Good, okay. It's time for random questions.
This is the more random. Go for it.
How do you feel like your name and like have you thought about your name as you've been thinking about naming of objects, naming of everything?
Yeah, I have a bit. So one thing that I do in the book is that no one has a name which is just a name. Like they have sort of mostly common nouns. It's like bird or moss or you know, ticket is one character's name. And so I was thinking like, oh, I could have a berry actually, like that would work. But I was trying to think of ways to kind of complicate, like, yeah, that sense of named characters, and it was helpful, especially when working on a book which is like implicitly a fantasy, to have a way out of doing the thing of like making up words, because that would be the next natural step where you'd have, you know, kind of like fantastical names for places and people, but instead like the places have names like you know, grit and tortoise and nod and things like that, which was a way to kind of keep it really down to earth, I think, hopefully. Yeah, I mean, my own name, which was given to me by my crazy hippie parents, like, you know, it doesn't like have a place in the world in on the one hand, but without giving away, I can't give away too much, but there's more to it than that, I guess I'll say. This is that question is a question which gets turned over a few times by the end of the book, but it's weirdly kind of connected to the plot.
Okay.
So yeah.
So, mine, I think. So I was listening to this interview with Chris Christopherson that was recorded a long time ago, and he was explaining the story of how he came to write Me and Bobby McGee, was a favorite song. So apparently he was employed as a songwriter in Nashville in the 60s and had lunch with his employer and said, I want you to write a song about, and I got the name of the song. And the name of the song is Me and Bobby McGee. So he got the name wrong. He heard it wrong. So it was an actual person named Bobby McGee, and the twist
with a
was
K.
that the guy sold him was this Bobby McGee is a woman. So it struck me as you were telling your story that you sort of had this external prompt. That
Right.
I wonder how often that sort of thing happens, where we're goaded into action that we might not have really, it might have been percolating. I mean, in this case, the whole germ came from somebody else, and then he just took it and made his own world.
Right, right. Yeah, I think it can be so helpful to have a prompt like that sometimes. Being given a title or being given some criteria that you need to meet. I mean, I suppose this is, you could maybe speak more to this, Travis, but like I feel like it's, you know, so much poetry, you know, at least traditionally, like comes out of a sort of, you've got a form that you have to fit it to. Yeah, I've this is a thing that comes up in game design often for me, where I really like having a sort of mix and match element in play, where like a couple phrases will be randomly assigned to another couple of phrases, and then suddenly you've got a prompt that you have to just work with. And somehow it can do so much. Like, it gives you the starting point, and then you might think like you would be stuck, but suddenly you've got something to work with, and it just goes. So yeah, I think the title of this book weirdly came pretty late. I was calling it something very different for well over a decade. But that was a process that was a surprise, that it came out of a conversation with the editor, who, again, I was like really lucky that he got a good feeling for what I was going for. And it was a negotiation too, but yeah.
Apparently that's what editors are good at.
Yes.
Naming books.
Yeah. He had a different title, which I actually rejected, but it became the title of part 1 of the book, which is The Word for Trouble, which I really love that phrase. He wanted that to be the title of the book, but I felt like it wasn't quite right for the book itself. And so then I looked back into the material of the novel and thought about if there was something else I could pull from it. And naming songs are a thing in the book. Basically, there are these children's rhymes that are taught to help kids remember words as they're introduced to the world. And so these naming songs are these little rhymes, but then they also kind of become something bigger over the course of the story.
Well,
It's a great title. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't imagine it being any other title. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. Yeah.
So back to this wonderful cover. Could you talk about your attraction to trains and how that is a metaphor for probably many things in this book?
Sure. Yes. Trains. Sometimes there are things like that I'm so attached to that it's almost difficult to speak about rationally. Like I just have an unreasonable love of trains. But I think part of it maybe comes from growing up in a small town that the trains passed through, and hearing them at night. Like whenever I can hear a train whistle, I'm just immediately like, I must be home. I love working on trains. I love the feeling of being still while also moving across a landscape, being able to take in a landscape. So I came up with a lot of reasons in the book for why the names committee lives on a train, but when it comes down to it, I just wanted to.
You just needed
it to be on a train. Yeah. A lot of the book actually does take place on 2 trains in particular. There's this other train called the Black Square Show, which is a traveling show, and they put on performances that have a lot to do with like preserving stories. And then there's a third engine of significance, which I will not explain, but yeah, I just kept finding myself going back to trains. And I decided I decided that there would be the word for train and the word for engine in here, but there are no words for a bunch of other types of conveyance. And so therefore that gave me a good excuse to make it a very train-based society.
A very train.
Yes.
I love that.
And it was nice that they incorporated that into the cover. I thought they did a great job of that.
Yes, it's beautiful and it's mesmerizing if you love trains.
If you love trains, yes.
If
you hate trains,
expect.
yes.
Yeah.
So, how many people were in your town growing up?
Oh gosh, I'm not actually sure what the population was. I should probably know that, but
under a couple of thousand, or
I think
more
around
than
a couple
hundreds?
thousand.
Oh, about a
Yeah.
couple. Yeah, that's.
You've been there, Travis. How many people were there? I don't know. It's tricky because there's like the village and the town, and I grew up kind of in the village, and then the town is this much wider area that includes other like smaller sort of hamlets. So I'm not exactly sure technically what it is, but yeah, I mean a little town on the Hudson River.
Very pretty. I saw pictures, and it's just beautiful.
Oh yeah. No, it's true. It is a really beautiful spot.
Yeah. And the Hudson River is magical, also. So
it is, yeah. Rip Van Winkle is kind of our patron saint there.
yes.
And growing up there, they have you read the Tales of Washington Irving, As I recall, they did not tell us what was history and what wasn't. And so I actually kind of grew up thinking that this man really had gone to sleep in the Catskill Mountains for 20 years. Maybe he was still up there. The Headless Horseman, very, very real to me.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I just love that stuff, and that's probably part of why my brain is the way it is. Like,
One of my
what's that?
You grew up in Sleepy Hollow?
I grew up in Catskill, which is the town, which is mentioned in Rip Van Winkle. It's like the town at the base of the mountains where that story takes place. I have been to Sleepy Hollow recently, so there's.
And that is that whole concept is really scary to kids too. I mean, it's both enchanting and appealing, but also scary. Sort of like you go to sleep and you wake up and everyone's gone and you don't know where you are, and
The
a
whole.
real dislocation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. One day you're a colony, and the next day a revolution has happened. You wake up and everything has changed. But no, you're right. I think that's true. That there's something there that's not just like there's the American historical aspect of it, but I think there's that children's story aspect of it too, where it captures a definite feeling. Yeah. The uncertainty of just kind of waking up and learning the world all the time, and there's always so much to take in. Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and for those excellent questions. This has been really fun.
I like that you took it and made it discussion. It was wonderful.